everybody. Hi. It is such a pleasure to be here. Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming out to be with us this very snowy evening, the last before the plunge in temperature. I'm Rachel Cohen. I'm a professor of practice in the arts here at the University of Chicago's Creative Writing Program, and we're thrilled to have here with us Brigid Hughes, visionary editor of the groundbreaking and Whiting Award-winning literary magazine A Public Space, and writer Jamel Brinkley, whose brilliant and deeply beautiful book of short stories, A Lucky Man, has this year been a finalist for the National Book Award and is currently a finalist for the Penn Robert Bingham Prize. I have spent the last few days really immersed in reading Brinkley's stories and in reading interviews with him, and I just wish that experience for all of you here. His language has been changing the shape of my mind, and I'm really grateful for that experience. This event comes about in part through the support of the Office of the Vice Provost for Academic Leadership Advancement and Diversity, from which we received a grant, and we want to thank them. And it also comes about through the conceptualization of important people in our program who I want to thank, Jessie Haley and Starsha Gill, and Rachel DeWaskin, faculty fiction member Rachel DeWaskin. The idea for this program was to think with writers and editors about the landscape of publishing and how writers find their way into and through that landscape, what editors do and can do to shape that landscape, and also about the reading public, the reviewers, the booksellers, the blogosphere, the whole complex interaction that affects all of our reading and our writing lives. We were and are especially interested in emerging voices and thinking about a diversity of voices, and our thoughts immediately turned to Brigid and to A Public Space. Since 2006, Brigid Hughes has fostered and supported and discovered many dozens of the writers who I think are among the most exciting and revelatory writers in our landscape. And she's been extremely perceptive about how to broaden that support and make it count. Two programs of many I might mention are the Public Space Fellows Program, which supports writers in the very emerging moments of their careers, and the partnership A Public Space has with Grey Wolf Books that has brought out a series of really unbelievable books, of which one of the most recent is A Lucky Man. So I know that both of you have given a lot of thought to the issues that we're going to talk about here this evening, and I mean mostly to let you talk. But I thought, as a way of framing the conversation a little bit, that something that I thought might be interesting to start from is the title of the magazine, A Public Space. I know when I wrote for A Public Space now 10 years ago, it mattered to me that that was the title of it. I thought a lot about entering a public space, what kind of space that was. It's a magazine that's very attuned to spatial considerations. There's a lot about urban landscapes. There's a lot of unusual travelogues. There's a lot of visual material in it, and I knew that my writing would live next to those things. So that seemed like a way of thinking also about the kinds of interactions that people have, the way that things can build between people and among people in a space. And then, of course, the public concept of it also seems significant, and I imagine for you in this kind of whirlwind year of going from not a lot of public to really a lot of public, that may have, you might have things to say about that too. So maybe we can begin there, and then I'll jump in as I think of things. Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you, Rachel, for inviting me to be here, and Jamel for being here. It has been kind of a whirlwind, I know, for Jamel this past year, and it's been a great treat for us to get to watch this whole process. I first read Jamel's work, I was looking back at the first email. It was in the fall of 2013, and I got an email from one of our contributing editors, a writer named Ian Lee, and at the time she was teaching in a summer workshop. I was editing an essay of hers, so she sent a draft of her essay, and she also said, and here are 3 stories by this writer who's in one of my classes. What do you think? And they were 3 stories, later versions of which appeared in the debut collection. So it's been a joy to get to be part of that process. And maybe I'll go back sort of a couple of years before that to when we started the magazine. We published the first issue in 2006. I had edited the Paris Review before that, and kind of in the 6 months between the Paris Review and launching A Public Space, spent a lot of time with a group of contributing editors thinking about what we wanted the magazine to be, what a literary magazine was and should be, and what the role of an editor was. And one of the reasons we chose A Public Space as the title was because we liked the idea of the magazine embracing a kind of openness, and as editors ourselves embracing that openness and seeing in how many directions we could stretch ourselves instead of trying to stay sort of put together a magazine that was narrowly defined by our own taste. So at the beginning that included working with somebody like the translator Motoyuki Shibata, who's one of the main translators, along with Haruki Murakami, of American fiction into Japanese. And so we worked with him to put together a portfolio in the first issue looking at contemporary Japanese fiction and how they had been influenced by American writers. So for me, that was a very unfamiliar space to be in. I wasn't a big reader of Japanese fiction. A number of the stories we looked at really kind of stretched my comfort level as a reader, and to me that was just a really exciting space to be in. And that's something that we've tried to carry forward in different ways through each issue of the magazine. So we've looked at a lot of work in translation. We've looked at including a lot of debut writers has been important to the magazine. Also kind of stretching back to publish writers who had maybe been overlooked or whose work had never yet been translated into English. And somehow to try to fit those all together into some sort of collective so that the different pieces were speaking to each other, which to my mind is kind of what happens ideally in a public space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. And I also want to express my thanks for being invited to do this event with Brigid. You know, I just want to say about a public space, I remember seeing the first issue of it. Yeah. And in fact, I think, wasn't Charles D'Ambrosio in that issue?
He was, yes.
Yeah, so I remember seeing that issue and reading that story. And the reason I bring this up is because I think, you know, just about this magazine, I think it's really beautiful. It's just a very sort of carefully curated object. It catches your eye, and that's before you even open the pages. And inside, I think, you know, when you start to read the work that's inside, you realize that the title of the magazine is no accident, a public space. It actually reminds me a little of, there's a science fiction writer named Samuel Delany.
Oh, yeah.
And he has a book called Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. And he talks about the difference between networking and contact. And networking is sort of a pre-shaped encounter. And pretty much there are going to be no surprises. You know why you're there. You know what you're getting into when you show up to a situation of networking. And he says that's what the new Times Square is in New York, basically. But the old Times Square, the kind of the gritty kind of Times Square, is more about contact, meaning you show up and all there is surprise. All you're going to encounter is stuff that you've never seen before, stuff that's interesting, voices you've never heard before. And that's what this magazine feels like to me. It feels like a magazine of contact. So in that sense, it's a public space in the most exciting sense. So it was really a thrill for me to have my work end up. My first two stories, in fact, end up in this journal. Yeah.
That's a lovely answer. Plus, I'm happy to think about that book, which I haven't thought about in a while. Yeah, I think that that's something that comes out a lot in your stories, and that you've said in interviews that you're looking for your characters to come into contact and to surprise one another, and I definitely have the sense that your stories create unusual spaces in which things happen between characters, and I would say that that's characteristic of work in a public space, even though there's almost no other house style. Like there's no sense of like the syntax is always one way or the point of view is always one way, but there is like oddness of space in a lot of the space of the language, not that it's all writing about space, but that's an experience I have repeatedly in reading the magazine. I guess I'm curious for you to say a little bit about how you developed that work together and how you thought about who might read it and how you thought about it, how you think about readership.
Mm-hmm.
The question of the reader is always kind of a puzzling one to me. On the one hand, I think we don't think about the reader at all. And on the other hand, we're very much wanting to put together a magazine and to have that sense that you are sharing something that you love with someone beyond you, and there's that way of kind of extending this network of connections. In this case with Jamel's story, they were just those. I mean, we've been doing the magazine now for 12 years, and in those 12 years, there are a handful of moments where you remember opening up that page and reading that first paragraph or even that first sentence and knowing that this was something just very, very special. And we worked, I think, with Jamel over a series. It happened very quickly. I think we read the stories in the fall, and we had published the first one by the early spring. Mm-hmm. And it was a process where, again, one of our contributing editors had sent in the stories initially, and so they were kind of it was kind of a conversation happening among a trio of people. Ian and I had a number of conversations. Jamel and I had a number of conversations. Then Jamel sort of went off and worked very kind of quietly on his own, but thinking very deeply about the kind of the editorial notes that we had sent. And there was kind of a I don't how to put it. It wasn't like we were talking every day and doing the edits, but there was kind of this silent conversation that was happening through the course of seeing various drafts of his story.
Yeah. I mean, even though we weren't talking every day or having this sort of drawn out, explicit conversation, the notes that I got from you resonated because they were different than almost any other kind of notes I've gotten, whether in an editorial context or a workshop context. The notes were filled with questions. And I think I heard someone say, it might have been Sarah Micah, she said she thinks she only speak in questions, right? But I think, so imagine a manuscript page, and, when you see the track changes on the side, it's just lots of questions. And maybe some of them are just sort of basic questions about the world, or logistical questions, continuity questions. But many of them were not of that nature. Most of them, I think, were just sort of the kinds of questions that are driven by curiosity about the world in the story. Meaning that I felt like the integrity of my story had been accepted already. Mm-hmm. I felt like my characters had been accepted. I felt like there was already a certain amount of respect for me as a writer and for the world that I created in the stories. And so the response to that world was one of, tell me more about that. I want to know more about her. I want to know more about this. And that sense of something you've created generating questions from people is actually really exciting. It makes it feel like, it's like going on a date a little bit. Like someone's like wants to know you, or they're interested in you, and I really love that. I really love that there was this genuine curiosity about my characters, and in response to those questions, I was able to go back and explore the world I had created more closely, right? Because as a writer, there are always things you don't quite know or don't quite see. You try to see as much as possible. You try to know as much as possible, but there are things you maybe don't think about fully. So having the opportunity to dive back into my world myself and figure some things out, to get to know my own characters better, was really exciting for me.
Yeah. And that's sort of like there's this kind of, there are sudden lurches and there are gradual movements in like bringing one's work into the world or something. There are these kind of moments where it feels like, oh, somebody's here it's not just me in this story, somebody's here with me. And so there's an editor is a reader as well as, then they become somebody who's thinking toward further readers. But there's this kind of, sometimes they're the first person who lives near the world with you, or, yeah. So how did you then think about further readers? Like, did you have a sense of I've read in some interviews you're saying that that you don't want to do kind of tourist fiction, that you want to write in a way that doesn't do that. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you think about readers, or how you're...
Yeah, I think about readers in a couple of ways. On the one hand, I agree with you that I don't want to really think about readers at all. Yeah. And there are reasons for that. Because then you start, tailoring your work perhaps in a way that is unnecessary or not beneficial to the fiction. On the other hand, I think I want to be very deliberate about thinking about readers. And here's why. I think, well, first of all, that quote about tourist fiction actually comes from a workshop that I had with you. Yeah. She said, don't write tourist fiction. She said, don't write safari fiction.
Yeah.
Meaning, don't go out of your way to over-explain your world, as if your reader can't fall into it, as if your reader needs their hand held. And I just think that's a smart thing by itself. But then I also think, like, when you talk about the reader or readers in this kind of abstract way, my thought is it starts to take on some of the problems that happen when we talk about anyone in an unmarked way. Whenever we talk about anyone in an unmarked way, the default seems to be that we're talking about a white male straight person, probably, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't do the specifying, race, gender, etc., then you can find yourself thinking about talking about the reader, but pandering to a certain type of reader, right? So in that sense, I do like to think of my readership as being people like me, people like the people in my family, people like the people I grew up with, which is, for me, like a diverse, educated, but not necessarily book smart, but maybe book smart, kind of urban, sophisticated in their own way. But, there are all these things that fall into it. So in that sense, I do like to think of readers in a very sort of deliberate way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Was that the case from the beginning when you started writing? Was it something that you started to pay attention to?
I think I started to pay more attention to it when I started taking writing workshops. Because there's a certain kind of language that starts to, recycle itself, from workshop to workshop. And then, which is great, I'm not here to disparage workshops. Workshops have been really good to me. But I do think that we can sort of fall into these traps where we're talking about work in a way that makes certain assumptions about readership.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, just sort of widening out the circles, and soon I want to also ask for questions from the audience here. But then, there's publishing a first story, like sending it into the world, and it's in a literary magazine. There's the thrill of like seeing your name and like you're there where you were once reading other people's names, and then there start to be readers, expected and unexpected readers, and then there were challenges to placing this book, but then once you placed it, it had suddenly a very large kind of response. And then there are reviewers who have their different opinions, and there's situating and pigeonholing and positioning. Do you want to say some things about those things, either or both of you?
Yeah, it's a fascinating process, and I think the editor plays a number of different roles depending on where the work is in that process. When you shift from publishing the story in the magazine to publishing the collection, there are different questions that you start thinking about, and one of those questions involves, marketing and the question of the audience. And I think part of the editor's role in that instance is a little bit to be the defender of the work, so that and of the writer, so that they can sort of exist in that space where where what is important to them and what's important to the book doesn't get lost in all of that noise around it, and also to try to help shape what the conversation about the book is going to be, and how wide or how narrow that you're able to make that conversation.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Like the wideness, the narrowness, the shaping, like what kinds of things do you think about?
Well, I think part of the role when you're publishing the book is to think of both how are we going to reach an audience, and are we going to try to reach as wide of an audience as possible, and what's going on kind of in the world at large that this book maybe resonates with, and to what extent do we want to connect this book with that conversation, and to what extent do we want to connect the book with other conversations that are maybe not getting as much attention but that feel crucial to the book. And I think that's a conversation that the editor makes in conjunction with the author and with conjunction with the marketing and publicity department. And there's just a much wider network of people involved in bringing a book out into the world than there is bringing a magazine out into the world.
Yeah.
A couple of things come to mind. I think in terms of approaching an audience or building an audience, I think the strategy for my book ended up being, let's take our time, first of all, and sort of build this book very slowly. We're not going to rush it out. So it took 2 years from the time that it was sold. So essentially a year for editing, and then another year just to sort of build, support and interest in the book. And a lot of that happened through, I have to give a shout out to independent bookstores and independent booksellers. So really approaching building an audience through independent bookstores, and folks who really care about books, folks who make the effort to hand sell books to people. I feel like a lot of the early momentum that was behind my book was because of that, which was wonderful. And then I guess the other thing that I would say, in terms of attaching the book to conversations that are going on, and not attaching it to conversations that are going on. So when my agent and I sent the book out, when the book was sold, when I had my initial editorial conversations, masculinity was part of the conversation, right? Of course. And the book invites that. It's 9 stories. All 9 stories have a male protagonist. One of them also has a female protagonist. But it's very specific in its concerns in that sense. So masculinity was part of the equation. And I remember filling out my little editorial questionnaire from my publisher, where they say, what do you think the book is about? And the word masculinity was in there, along with many other words, right? But of course, once you mention one of the words that's a buzzword, that's the word that people latch onto. So it's been interesting to watch how my book has sort of been swept up in the broader cultural conversation that's happening about toxic masculinity, the Me Too movement, all these kinds of things. That's been interesting. And on the one hand, I'm glad that some people can read the book and see that it has a place in that conversation. On the other hand, I feel like I have to resist the book being an exploration of toxic masculinity, right?
Cast in some way.
Yeah. Because I think, or I hope that the book is more than that.
Yeah, I know. I read enough interviews with you that I was like, I am not going to say the word masculinity first.
It's great for me to say.
I am not going to do that. Yeah, there was a nice interview with Brandon Taylor. Yes. I think it seemed like he had a way of redirecting that conversation that seemed like it was more fruitful. It brought out more things about what you were really interested to do in your project. And that's, I think interviewing is also more and more. My first book came out 15 years ago, more than that, and we did interviews, but now everybody seems like they're being interviewed and interviewing one another in a kind of constant way. Like there's a big, so that then the sort of expressing yourself in conversation with people who you may or may not know becomes like a big part of how your book gets understood and passed around. And
it's true.
And if people are approaching you in a typecasting way, if they start with the question, "Tell me about toxic masculinity," then it's very hard to push enough space for
it is. Yeah. And I have to say in response to that, actually, so I've done a number of interviews at this point, and you kind of almost always have a choice. Do you want to talk to someone, or do you want to do this over email? And it takes a lot longer to do a written interview over email. But that's almost always the way I choose to do it.
I wondered.
Because I want to be able to shape the narrative about the book a little bit more. If you're just sort of talking to someone on the phone for 15 minutes, I think it's easy for them to sort of pull things out from your conversation and then, present your book in the way that they wanted to present it in the first place,
Yep.
which may not be the way that I wanted to present it. So even though, again, like I mean, I'm lucky that the book is doing well, but that's meant I'm doing a lot of events and I've been busy. So the choice to do written interviews, takes a lot more time, but I'm willing to devote
Yes.
that time in order to sort of give my take on the
Yes,
book.
it means that what's on the record has subtlety,
Right.
which is otherwise. Go
Can I
ahead.
cheat and ask a question about 15 years ago?
Yeah.
And what was the primary way that your book was discussed? Was it through reviews?
The first book I published was called A Chance Meeting, and that was, it was 2004 or something that book came out. And yes, it was a lot of reviews, and then on book tour you did radio.
Okay.
You did local radio while you were on book
Yeah.
tour. And then even that was starting to shift, that you could do radio by the phone and stuff,
Yeah.
but you still mostly went to radio stations and sound like an ancient person with my, typing. In the old days, we constantly were saying. So that was a lot of it. There was, I think I maybe did a couple of interviews, but they were,
It's become a much bigger part.
it has become a much,
Yeah.
the self-presentation and the, I'm interested in that. It's something that comes up in your work. Also, the sort of question of like the performance of oneself. Like, are you, and the sort of question of authenticity of a self. And but I do feel that there are a lot of demands of performance demands as part of putting literary work out into the world now. Yeah. Should we start taking some questions from people here? I know many of you may have questions. Vu? Yeah.
I have a question for Brigid. So a lot of our students right now are beginning to do, the whole process of sending their work out, and usually to magazines first. And it's been about 10, 15 years since I was doing that, only because I don't write short stories much anymore. But so it doesn't. It seems like it's a very different landscape now. For example, I don't think people did what I did. Just put, your story,
Right.
In an envelope, yeah.
And if you get back
The essay,
the white
right,
envelope,
yes.
then you think, okay, that's an acceptance. If you get back the vanilla envelope, that means they don't want you. But I'm sure there are a lot of other differences, and I was curious how for you as an editor, but perhaps you also know from the point of view of writers, how the landscape has changed over the last 10, 15 years.
How has the landscape changed? Well, 10, 15 years ago when I was reading submissions, you're right, they would come in largely through the mail, and we would have in the office manila folders, and each manila folder would have maybe 20 submissions in it, and that was sort of, you would do it folder by folder. So you'd come in and you'd be surrounded by these, mountains of manuscripts. Now most of the work that we get comes through an online system, and I imagine many, if not all of you, are familiar with something called Submittable, which is what we use for submissions. The benefit of it is it makes it much easier for people to reach us, both kind of within the States, and we have many more international submissions. I think it makes people a little more casual about submitting work, and they tend to sort of just hit that submit button and submit to a much wider range of publications. So we do see that there's probably an increase in the volume of submissions and kind of a decrease in the number of people who are thinking specifically about, I chose this magazine to send my work to. I think there's probably been an increase in the number of magazines that are available to submit work to. And it's been probably a decrease in how easy it is to kind of do your research on magazines. When I was 10, 15 years ago. There still used to be, at least in Chicago when I lived here and in New York when I lived there, these wonderful magazine shops that you could go into and just spend an afternoon browsing through hundreds of, big to tiny little magazines, and that's much harder for people to do nowadays. But you're still getting, in many ways it's much the same. You're still getting the submissions. You're still eagerly opening each one, hoping to find that thing that thrills you.
By the way, is it very important to really think about the magazine you're submitting to,
Well, I like to think it is.
I do too, but some people don't believe that.
I think it probably depends on each person. I think for some people, the amount of, there's a certain anxiety about submitting work, and maybe spending too much time thinking about which is the perfect magazine to submit to is going to discourage you further from submitting your work. I think you want to pay a little bit of attention to where you want your work to come out and what kind of the forum that you think is the best one and the most exciting one for you to be a part of. It may be a magazine with a large circulation, but it may very well be a smaller community that has kind of a very tight readership, and that can be just as important for you as a writer and for reaching your readers and for going on to kind of build a career out of that as publishing in a magazine with a very large circulation.
I have a question about the idea of switching gears. How do you think it has worked for you personally in switching either from one short story to another, which may be very different, or from different parts in the writing and publishing process?
Do you work on multiple stories at the same time?
I try,
Yeah.
but I can't. So, I think I don't work on more than one thing at a time, and there's usually a gap between the time that I'm working on one story to another story. Because I think I've been so immersed in whatever I've been working on that it's hard for me to just sort of switch gears and go to the next thing. It's like I'm still in that world. I can't, so I'm sort of dragging some of that world into the new story, and I don't want to do that. So usually when I'm done, quote unquote done with a story, it takes a while for me to start writing again. So I'll kind of just read for a while, have some palate cleansing until I feel like I'm ready to explore some new lives, some new places. So it takes a while. Yeah. What was the other part of your question? The other part of switching gears?
That was it basically, but I was sort of splitting it up in terms of what both of you may have learned about like how you may view the world, especially the world of writing from one perspective, reading a lot of things as an editor, but then later on seeing editing in a new way and seeing the world of writing.
I'm not sure I quite understand what you're asking about the difference between.
It's the type of question that especially made sense in terms of the short story concept, but I also was interested whether you had any thoughts on how you have changed your mindset over the course
Of my career. I think that I have become, I think that as you edit more and as you read more, you're more open to making mistakes or to asking the wrong question. And early on you think you always have to ask. You have to know just the thing to ask the author that's going to, break open the story. Or that your role as an editor is to fix the story. That's not my role as an editor at all. I think my role is to try to find and bring out the life in a story and to keep myself out of the story in a sense. And to make it more the author's own story. And maybe that's something that I've become more aware of and comfortable with, I think, over the years.
Could you talk a little bit more about that, Brigid? Because, I think, at least I feel, and maybe many of us feel, a certain anxiety about the workshop process and how that has sort of shaped the literary landscape over the last, 30 years or whatever. Because it's kind of hard to imagine Kafka or even Grace Paley, coming from that. Everything is sort of tuned and calibrated. We've answered all the questions, we've addressed all the critiques and everything like that. Yeah. I'm really interested to hear that your process sounds a little more Socratic or something.
Yeah.
But are you conscious of, let's keep some mystery intact here, there might be something in this piece that I can't really explain, I can't get at, can't quite verbalize what I love about it.
Right.
So are you conscious of sort of, keeping that intact? Or Jamel, same for you, if you have something that's like, there's just this thing about the story, I know it's a little strange, I know it's a little, but I need to preserve that.
Yeah, I think that's the beating heart of the piece and what drew you to it in the first place. And over the course of publishing a story, we will read it 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. So if everything in the story is explained to you, by the time you're reading it the second time, you're bored. By the time you're reading it the third time, you resent the piece. by the time, So I think if anything, you're trying to bring out the mystery and not solve it.
Yeah, that seems right to me too. And I think, at this point I've taken a zillion workshops, and I'm in another one right now. So I'm very aware of being, a workshop writer in some sense. But actually something that Ian said, I think this is when you were both in Iowa City a couple of years ago. It may not have been then, but I feel like at that event, and correct me if I'm wrong, she said something like, editing is not about craft. Editing is about finding the life in the story.
Yeah.
Which I really like, especially having been through a million workshops. Because there's a certain kind of you workshop, you put the story on a thing, it goes up, and you tighten this, you crank that up, and it just sort of feels like it's gone through this mechanism to you fix the story. It's gone through this process. You've addressed all the concerns, like you've said. You've answered all the questions. But then if you think of editing along those lines as preserving the mystery or finding the life, then it actually makes editing more exciting than workshopping, if that makes sense. Like you can take something that's been workshopped to death and then edit it in a way that actually makes it more interesting, makes it a little shaggier, makes it a little more mysterious, makes it more like, something Kafka would write or something Grace Paley would write, And so I kind of like the idea that, when you're in the final stages of editing a piece, it's kind of about adding some, put a weird thing in there, or find something strange and interesting and keep it.
You've sort of gotten past the gate in a way, so.
Yeah.
No, it's not wrong. It's not primarily wrong. It's primarily right.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, you also have to think at a magazine, we're reading, say, 10,000 to 20,000 submissions a year. A number of them from students who have gone through workshops. So to see the well-crafted story, I think we were joking at the Iowa event that an editor has never sort of run up to another editor and said, "Oh my God, this is the most well-crafted story. We must publish it." That's not really what draws you to the piece. I think maybe when you're starting out as a reader and first reading, that's the piece that you feel more comfortable promoting. There's kind of less of a risk of saying, "Let's look at this story." And it is a skill, to be able to put together a well-told story. But sometimes it's that one that's in many ways a disaster and not working, but has something that just feels alive. And that's kind of the one that's most exciting, I think, for an editor to stumble across when you're spending an afternoon looking through submissions.
I wanted to ask a question about almost like family language, drawing on the thing you said, I'm writing in a way for the people who are of my immediate vicinity. I kind of think that every writer, to begin with, it's as if nobody understands how to read them. You start writing, you send things out, and nobody knows what to make of it. And then little by little, it's as if the universe shifts a little bit and the language becomes readable to some people anyway. And I think one of the skills of being an editor is seeing that it's there, and kind of starting to find a way to direct its attention or its lift to the surface the thing that's under there. But in my own history and in most people's history, I think there's a long period of submitting work where it's almost there and yet nobody can read it or something, and then it almost seems as if there's some shift in time and then people can read it. And I wonder, especially for people who are writing in language that isn't for that default white straight male reader, it seems like that would compound the difficulty. It seems like an editor would need to feel unusually alert to kind of be able to see what's happening in the language. But maybe that's not the right way of framing it. But
I mean, I'm aware that I have, that submissions have come in that I have missed. I read it in the wrong mood on the wrong day, but there's something about coming across something that isn't familiar to you that is what that it is what grabs your attention.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the question is, as an editor, are you willing to trust that experience and that sort of, I'm not quite comfortable here, but there's something that I'm curious about, and sort of to follow it, or if you sort of think like I need to know where I am, and I need to be in control here as the reader if I'm going to be the editor for this story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that actually resonates with the way that ideally I feel when I'm writing a story. If I feel like I'm a little too comfortable and I know exactly what's going on and I know the next move and I know the next move and I know the next move, then odds are the story that I'm writing is dead in the water. But if I feel pretty confused, but I have a sense that there's something here, even if I haven't quite touched it yet, but there's something here, and it may take me a few drafts to get to it, but this sort of messy, meandering, strange draft where I'm taking the next step in the dark and the next step in the dark and the next step in the dark is actually way more exciting for me. And I'm saying it as a short story writer. I don't know if that would work if I were writing novels. But as a short story writer, I sort of like that feeling of strange uncertainty. Like I don't really know what this is. I don't know what's happening right here. Why did I write that sentence? I like that feeling. And if I don't have it, then I hadn't written a story that worked that didn't have that feeling.
Yeah. Questions out there? Yeah, Michael, and then in the back row.
I'm going to stand so I can see up. Correct me if I'm wrong, Infinite Happiness and Happy Man came out in back-to-back issues, yes?
Yep, A Lucky Man, yep.
So I want to ask each of you about kind of both sides of that coin. Brigid, for editing, I've been on much less important editorial staffs where there's a rule, either spoken or unspoken, against publishing the same writer in back-to-back issues for reasons relating to either we want to keep that spot open for someone who we haven't given exposure to, what have you. And I imagine with something like a public space, that's a strong consideration because that's the kind of publication, one of few really, that has the power to put people on, right? Like has the power to get someone an agent, get someone the kind of exposure they never had before. Like you said, 20,000 people a year wanting that from that magazine. So I was wondering if that factors in for you at all when moments like that come up. And then as a writer, Jamel, there's a lot of writers who would. You spoke already about why you felt that was a good home for your work and why it felt comfortable there, and that all made total sense. At the same time, there's a lot of writers that would have said, "Well, I just had my work there. I want to pollinate some other market." Whoever read issue 21 of Public Space, it's not going to be terribly different than the audience of issue 22 of Public Space. So I'm going to go to Plowshares. I'm going to go to Grant. I'm going to go somewhere else. And if that factored in at all for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. This was a rare case for us. We took the two stories at the same time, I think, more or less. So one of the things we do at a public space is we like to introduce writers. And we see that kind of as an ongoing process. So we've published, say, a writer like Leslie Jamison. We published her first short story and then published in later issues some of the first essays that she was working on. And I guess we felt that was important for us to support the writer's career. And that has taken a number of different forms. In the case of Jamel's stories, it was just it was a unique situation. It was a unique publishing schedule for us. And they happened to be two stories that were important to us and that we felt fit well in those two issues. So it's not something we generally do, but it is something that we occasionally do. And partly that's because it feels important to us to really invest in a writer and to, it can be a long process between publishing the first story to finding a place to put that second story, to finishing a collection, to finding a home for the collection. In the case of, I think, A Lucky Man, it was 2013 we saw the first stories, and then the book came out, 5 years later. That's a fairly quick cycle, I would say.
Yeah.
So, we try to sort of bring in new writers each time, but we do have a certain group of writers that we have published repeatedly in the magazine, and that is somewhat intentional.
Yeah, for me, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the stories were taken around the same time. and I'd never been published before. So I was like, they want 2 stories? That's amazing. I can't believe it. So I was just so thrilled about that, and so thrilled to be in a public space that I didn't think like, no, you can't have that other one. I'm going to try it somewhere else. So I was really excited to be there. And you know, it took a couple of years for me to have a publication in another journal, actually. So for a while, I had the 2 stories in a public space, and I remember my agent at one point said, I don't know what we were talking about, but she said something like, Jamel, I don't know if you're worried about this, but don't worry. You will be published somewhere besides a public space. You know, but the question, the answer is I was just thrilled to have 2 stories that I've been really working hard on be accepted around the same time. And it may have been different if the situation weren't as unusual as it was.
I mean, I think the question that you're asking partly comes up when maybe you're doing first serial submissions, when you have the book coming out and you're thinking about building an audience. And at that point in time, you probably would try to sort of send the stories out to as many magazines as possible. But I think for this moment in time, it made sense for us to do those 2 together.
Yeah.
We were a little selfish, yes.
There was a question all the way in the back, yeah.
Yeah, so I have kind of the same question but opposite for each of you. So for the editing side, what's the soonest when you read something that you know that you don't want to publish it or that you don't want to work with it? Like if it's not interesting you by the first or second paragraph, you just stop reading, or do you give everything a chance? And then conversely, how long have you spent writing something that you knew wasn't going anywhere? I guess for both, I'm kind of saying like how quickly do you know it's a loser?
Again, I will say, there's no perfect system, and I know that submissions have come in that we've looked at, and we've sort of missed something. But as a general rule, I think there will be something on the first 2 pages that catches my attention. It could be something tiny. It could be, a pairing of words, but something that grabs you. And in my experience, if there isn't something within those first 2 pages, that you aren't going to find it.
As for me, I think, hopefully I'm smarter about this now, but I've definitely written and worked on multiple drafts of a story that I should have given up on before. And I think, for me, I think the reason that those stories I was stubbornly pursuing didn't work is because I had a set agenda behind writing them. I'm going to write a story that does this in a very particular way that I wasn't willing to let go of in the process of writing it. So I just sort of stuck to my idea, And what that means is that your characters bend themselves to an idea. Their choices bend themselves to an idea, which is not a natural way for me anyway to write a story. But I tried to write stories in that way a couple years ago. And I think I've learned, I'm thinking of one story in particular. I think I've learned that if I see that happening, I need to take a step back and ask myself some serious questions. Like, okay, this may not be where you may not want to spend the next 5 months, 6 months working on this story, because it's not, your approach is wrong. You're not approaching it in the right way. You're being too close-minded with the story. So I think when I feel myself approaching a story in a closed-minded way, then I kind of know fairly early on now to let it go.
So then now when you write, do you find yourself not really seeing the end goal for your pieces until you're like halfway through it?
Ideally, I don't see the end of my pieces until just before the ending. That's sort of my ideal thrilling way of writing. If the story's 19 pages and I see the ending on page 18, I'm like, yes, this is great. I love this. Because I feel like I'm discovering the story too. If I'm writing a 20-page story and I see the ending on page 2, I get worried. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. Yeah, it is a good question. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about tone. in terms of editing. You can be generous, you can be polite, you can be humble as an editor, or you can be candid, blunt, direct, demanding. And how do you balance those? And then as a writer, do you mind if an editor is less than polite and generous and humble?
I have found that being polite does not lead to the best editorial conversation. But I think the question of how you get past that stage of politeness is always a sensitive one that is different with each author. I was looking at the editorial notes with Jamel's stories, and I can see in some places where I was a little polite and wasn't quite clear about what my question was or what I wanted to say. But I sort of think as we went along, we moved past that.
Yeah, for me, I don't really think about it in terms of polite and not polite. I think about it in terms of trust. And this is true whether I'm working with an editor or with a workshop instructor. If I feel like there's a relationship of trust there, and trust meaning the editor or workshop instructor has taken the time to really understand what I'm trying to do, respects what I'm trying to do, and sees the ways in which I can do that thing better, then I can take a harsher tone. In fact, I've had some rather harsh workshop leaders who respected me. So it completely worked. And I think the same thing is true in editing. Like if I feel as though you understand this story, you've thought about this a lot, that's a sign of trust and respect. So your very blunt question on page 9, I hear it. And I'm going to respond to it. And I'm glad you asked the question. Does that make sense? It's when I feel, and I have felt this, it's when you feel that the person responding to your work is not really there, hasn't really taken the time with it, that I start to get nervous. It doesn't matter what their tone is at that point. They can be as polite as they can be, but if I feel like you actually haven't thought about this at all, then I feel put off.
I think we probably have to stop. I'm sorry, I have many more questions, but please come talk to us and buy books and eat food. And thank you all so much for being here.